done all the heavy lifting around knowing what it means to issue invoices, and we operate in 30 countries. So knowing what it means to issue an invoice, and I'll give you another example. You've got the VAT issue in Canada, but in a place like Mexico, you actually have to get your invoices through an integration with the Mexican tax authority. So there's a completely different operating model in a place like Mexico. And so we've done all of that work. So we've got all that plumbing in place, done all of the development work to make sure that we can produce compliant invoices on behalf of our customers in all of these different markets.
This is the FinTech One-on-One podcast, the show for FinTech enthusiasts looking to better understand the leaders shaping FinTech and banking today. My name is Peter Renton, and since 2013, I've been conducting in-depth interviews with FinTech founders and banking executives. On the show today, we are talking B2B payments with Brandon Spear, the CEO of TreviPay, formerly known as MSTS. We discuss TreviPay's core business model and its innovative approach to cross-border payments. Brandon highlighted the company's transformation, which is quite interesting, from on-premise servers to a multi-tenant cloud platform. Its services in trade credit management, its partnership with major clients like Best Buy and Lenovo. We also touched on TreviPay's strategic partnership with HSBC and the company's vision to simplify B2B payments, drawing parallels to consumer payment innovations. Now, let's get on with the show. Welcome to the podcast, Brandon.
Great. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So I like to get these things started by giving the listeners some background. And I know you also don't speak with an American accent like me. And maybe you could explain how you first arrived at this country and what you did before TreviPay.
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. So my background is actually in software engineering, and I grew up in South Africa, which is where the strange accent comes from. And I've been in software businesses for most of my career. And one of those businesses, which was a procurement software business, moved me to the US about 25 years ago or so now. And so despite the fact that I've been here for 25 years, I still have the South African accent.
Yeah, well, I'm over 30 now, and I'm still going strong. I just went back for Christmas, and a lot of my friends said I have my accent has hardly changed. So good to see someone else doing the same thing there. Okay, so let's kick it off. Like, TreviPay is not. You guys have been around for many decades. Unlike most of the fintech CEOs that I get on the show, you're really running a very well-established company that's got a long track record. Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what TreviPay does and how you describe it today?
Yeah, of course, I'd be happy to. So to your point, the company's actually been around for a really long time, about 40 years, in fact. And it was a small business for a long time. It was privately held for a long time. I joined the company about 11 years ago after it had been sold to a large public business. And so my tenure with the company is more recent, but it's been around for a long time. In terms of what we actually do, so we really focus on helping suppliers, sellers offer trade credit to their business customers. And what that really entails is a lot of software, a lot of process automation, a lot of digitization, and it's technically referred to as the order to cash cycle inside of a supplier. So we offer them a platform that allows them to offer trade credit in a very efficient manner to their business customers. And then we also have a range of partners and funding options that if that's important to them, that they can leverage as well. So one of the biggest challenges as a seller, as a merchant these days, is how you fund your working capital. And the order to cash cycle is part of that, because if you do that well, you require less working capital. But even if you do that well and you're offering, say, 30-day terms to your clients, you have to find some mechanism for funding, extending that 30 days of credit. And so we have options around how to fund that as well. So the best way to think of us is we've got a pretty substantial platform, we've got some services wrapped around it, and we've also got some funding wrapped around it.
Are these pretty much exclusively businesses that are selling internationally across borders?
Great question. So a big part of our value proposition is about being able to sell internationally, and most importantly, being able to have an invoice in one currency, but being settled and paid in a different currency. So that's a big part of our value prop. But a lot of the customers we deal with are just domestic as well. So they're just
Hmm.
operating within, say, the US or Canada or Mexico, and and dealing with the order to cash challenges these days is something that is particularly difficult because regulations are changing all the time. Regulations
Right.
around know your customer, around things like money laundering, as well as there's just an absolute rise in fraud and in business identity theft and synthetic business identity theft.
Hmm.
And so if you're a B2B merchant these days and you're doing more and more of your business online, it becomes particularly challenging on how to navigate all of those different circumstances.
Right, right, right. So then when you're looking at these B2B companies and they're, I mean, a lot, I mean, most, not all, particularly if you go to sort of into South America or somewhere, there's plenty of companies that start with a cross-border business, but most start domestically and then expand into into international. And I'd love to get your perspective on when companies start looking beyond their own borders. What are some of the things they need to keep in mind, and what do they get wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that's like you are highlighting is not easy to navigate for someone that's looking to expand. And even if you look at, what would normally be considered a relatively simple expansion, a US company selling into Canada, a Canadian company selling into the US, there's an amazing amount of complexity associated with it. And it's everything from what constitutes an invoice in that market and how do invoices need to be formatted. And if you think about US companies that generally deal with sales tax, well, if you're selling into Canada, you've got to deal with VAT. And so there's a
Hmm.
different fundamental requirement about how invoices are put together. And then when you overlay on top of that, that most of your clients are going to want to have a local banking infrastructure that they can use and pay into. So when you issue an invoice, let's say you're a US company and you have clients in Canada, when you issue them an invoice, generally they're going to want it in Canadian dollars. They're not going to want it in US dollars because they don't want to deal with the foreign exchange risk. And then
Hmm.
they're also going to want to deal with a local bank that they can make a payment into so that they are not having to do an international wire, for example, because that becomes expensive. So establishing all of that infrastructure, the banking infrastructure or the sort of correspondent banking infrastructure, as well as all of the compliance requirements around invoices, etc., is just really onerous for many businesses.
Right. So maybe you could just expand on that a little bit. I'd love to kind of get a bit of a behind the curtain view of how you set up systems that make it really easy. You can use the Canadian example where,
Yeah.
you've one of your clients is all they care about is being invoiced and getting paid. They don't really care about any of the other pieces. But how do you set up those systems so that it's very simple for them?
Yeah, so that's a big part of the complexity that we just take off of the plate of the customers that we deal with because we've done all the heavy lifting around knowing what it means to issue invoices, and we operate in 30 countries. So knowing what it means to issue an invoice, and I'll give you another example. You've got the VAT issue in Canada, but in a place like Mexico, you actually have to get your invoices through an integration with the Mexican tax authority.
Right.
So there's a
Right.
completely different operating model in a place like Mexico. And so we've done all of that work. So we've got all that plumbing in place, done all of the development work to make sure that we can produce compliant invoices on behalf of our customers in all of these different markets. What we've also done is we've established banking relationships. We have 90 some odd
Right.
bank accounts in all of these countries so that there's pay in and pay out capabilities from in each of these markets so that you can if you have a merchant in that market, we can disperse money to them. But if they have customers in that market, there's also bank accounts that they can make payments into. And so a lot of this is really, and if you think about if you're a merchant and you're just trying to sell your widget or your service into this new market, you really don't necessarily want to have to deal with all of these sort of foundational things.
Right.
And particularly with e-commerce, right? It's easier than ever before to sell cross-border, but some of those other inherent barriers still exist. And so we try to eliminate those, largely remove those, so that the merchants we're working with can just focus on what they do best, which is selling their widgets or selling their services.
Right. So the merchant's customer is really, for all intents and purposes, making a domestic payment for an international transaction.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. They're making a domestic payment. They're receiving an invoice in their domicile currency. And so it's just so much slicker and simpler and easier for customer onboarding.
Gotcha. Okay, so I'm curious about particularly in the trade credit space, that banks have been doing this for,
Yeah.
for centuries, right? And what is it that you do that you've solved better than what the banks have been able to set up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it sort of talks to why there's such an interesting opportunity in this market overall. So to your point, this is not a new space. This has been around since trade first started, since businesses first started dealing with each other. The challenge that's existed is that the way that this is executed today is still very old school, meaning
Mm.
that the mechanisms that the banks use to participate and provide working capital today are, one of three things principally: a receivables finance agreement, which looks like factoring. You purchase the invoices and you have an advance against the invoices, or a securitization, which is really a more sophisticated version of the factoring.
Mhm.
Or the other alternatives is, some variation on a theme where you're providing advances or working capital loans, or in an asset-based loan, which all of which are incredibly manual and incredibly clunky. So what ends up happening is that the banks are really only able to serve relationships where the buyer and the seller represent somewhere north of $10 million in volume a year. They're
Hmm.
really only able to serve those efficiently because they can't go deeper into the book of customers that a merchant has, because the systems and the way that they do it doesn't scale effectively. The second portion of this is that if you're thinking about like a factoring type scenario or a receivables purchase arrangement, you as the bank don't necessarily know if the invoice is real. There's a lot of potential for fraud because the
Right.
buyer and the seller, you don't know the buyer, and the seller could be fabricating invoices. And so one of the real challenges in that space is what really is called invoice verification, where you have to do a sample of all the invoices that you're purchasing and validate that they are in fact accurate, valid invoices. So
Mm.
that's the world that exists today. So let me describe the world that exists, how we're trying to serve this. So, firstly, we don't purchase merchants' receivables. We actually help them create and generate the receivable in the first place. So,
Right.
we actually see the transaction occurring between the buyer and the seller, and then we're actually creating the invoice on behalf of the seller so that it's compliant in all these different markets and with all the different nuances that we were just talking about. So you effectively eliminate that whole challenge around invoice verification and is this actually a real transaction that's occurred between a buyer and a seller? And then the second piece of it is because all of this happens in real time on our platform, we can scale relationships down to about $10,000 a year from the $10 million a year threshold
Wow.
that the banks are typically looking at. So what that means is you can cover the whole base of customers that a merchant is dealing with, not just the very big guys. And so that then just essentially puts the merchants in a position where they don't actually have to worry about any of this. It's they can basically outsource the whole thing.
Right, right. So then who are these merchants typically? I mean, sounds like you're dealing with some small businesses, I imagine, as well as larger enterprises. I mean, maybe you could can you sort of give us some sense of who is using you?
Yeah, so a big part of how we go to market is we white label what we do. So a lot of the customers that we have, you'll know the brands, but you won't know that we're actually sitting behind doing the work. So
Mm.
I'll give you some examples. So for Best Buy is a big US customer of ours. And you might say, well, what is a retailer doing in there? And why are retailers, how is B2B working with retailers? So, one of the big customer segments that Best Buy serves are school districts. So, you can imagine all the electronics that school districts are buying, Chromebooks and laptops and all kinds of devices for schools. And those devices break and have to be repaired or new ones purchased. And all of that happens on our platform. So, somebody like Best Buy is a good example.
Hmm.
Somebody like Lenovo is an interesting example. Again, you might say, what's a big laptop manufacturer doing working with someone like us? Well, we're helping them serve their mid-market customers who they've typically sold to through resellers. And now they're starting to target those customers directly, where they actually want to own that end client relationship. And so we help them scale that, because you can imagine if you have 100 resellers that you work with today, that's very different from 10,000 end customers who you might be selling to. Another example, different example, General Motors is a customer of ours, and on all the aftermarket parts and service that they sell for the trucks that they sell into the freight and logistics markets. So we have these very large enterprise brands. We sit behind them. We provide them with this capability of selling to their business customers, where they don't really have to worry about managing all of the receivables and managing all of how they onboard new customers and issue the invoices and all the other pieces that go with it.
Are most of your customers US businesses then?
We have about a good question. So we have about 2/3 of our volume is in North America. So a combination of Mexico, US, and Canada, and then about 30% of our volume or so is in Europe, and about 5% is in Australia.
Hmm.
So we have a pretty interesting cross section of customers in each of them. And a lot of how our geographic expansion has happened is, you can imagine, when you have some of these big global brands, as we might start with them in one particular market. Somebody like Lenovo, for example, we actually started with them in Australia, and then we've moved with them to Europe, and we were with them in 17 countries in Europe. So a lot of our expansion has been on the back of, as our clients want to go to new places, then we help them move into some of these new locations, and we set up operations in those countries.
Right. So, how many countries do you actually have people on the ground?
We have people on the ground in about 7 or 8 countries, and we serve a total of 30 countries today.
Right.
That sounds like a really grand number, but there's a lot of countries in Europe, obviously.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. That's
yeah, so there's about 30 countries. So really, the best way to think about it is North America, Europe, and Australia, Singapore are the markets that we're in today.
right. Right. So, I want to sort of talk about B2B payments compared to consumer payments, because there's been a huge amount of innovation in the consumer payment space, and obviously you've got all of the BNPL and the different wallets and credit card options that you can have, and it seems like that it's really easy now for a consumer to buy things from anywhere, particularly a US consumer. How are you seeing, are you seeing much in the way of the innovation that's hit the consumer market? Is that sort of coming into the B2B payment space as well?
It definitely is. I think the reason that I think B2B is fundamentally probably 5 to 10 years behind where the consumer market is today is that B2B has more complexity, obviously. One of the ways I usually describe this is, when you make a purchase as a consumer, you are the CFO, you are the head of purchasing, you're also the head of accounts payable. And so,
Hmm.
you're one stakeholder that can fulfill all of those functions. Obviously, when you get into the B2B world, you'll have 4 or 5 stakeholders that are involved in a purchasing decision. And so you have to deal with some of that complexity. I think then the other challenge that flows from it is, there's also complexity within an industry, and then there's complexity within a geography. And so those 3 dimensions create, I think, barriers for how quickly you can develop something new, how quickly you can deploy it, because you have to deal with some of that inherent complexity. But I think what we're seeing is that if you do focus that way, so if you have solutions that are designed for an industry, if you have solutions that are designed for countries, and then you put those together and say, here's our solution for the automotive sector in Mexico, for example, then you can actually get a lot of traction with the customer base, because when you go and talk to them, they can inherently see how you're solving their specific problems versus trying to solve a generic problem. So I think the innovation is coming in B2B. It's just a little bit slower because you have all of those other nuances.
Right, right. And there certainly are other companies that are seeing the opportunity with B2B payments specifically. And there's some that have been around just 3 or 4 years that are really starting to try to get traction on these cross-border payments thing. Not that you're an old traditional bank, but you've been around a long time. How are you kind of competing and staying ahead of some of these newer upstarts?
So one of the very first things that I did when I joined here 10 years ago is I had my whole leadership team read what I think is a really interesting book called The Innovator's Dilemma.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And it's a great book. And if for any of your listeners, if you haven't read it, and you're in a technology business, it's worthwhile reading, because it really characterizes how you just cannot ever afford to sit on your, rest on your laurels, so to speak,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
that you have to have some creative destruction along the way, where you recognize that what you did historically is not necessarily going to be what you need to do to continue to win. So to give you an example, 10 years ago when I joined, our platform wasn't multi-tenant, and our platform was hosted on servers that we had in our office.
Wow. Okay.
And you kind of think about the world we live in today, right?
Right. That would be unheard of today.
That would be unheard of today. And so back then, we made the painful decision okay, we have to rewrite the whole platform. We have to make it multi-tenant, and we have to shift all of it to the cloud. And that process took us, the better part of 5 years.
Right.
And we now have a completely multi-tenant cloud-based platform, which if we hadn't done that and started that process 10 years ago, we'd be in real trouble today. Like, we would have a set of costs that would not be scaling. And I think that's kind of at the heart of all of these technology transitions, is you have to identify them early enough that they're going to be transformational and lean into it. I mean, the one I'm sure we probably will talk about it at some point, but the one here is AI, right? Currently, like, what are you going to do with respect to AI? How does it potentially disrupt our business and the value chains that we serve? And you can't afford to stick your head in the sand with that. You've just really got to be proactive and adopt it and figure it out. And otherwise, to your point, you'll either get bypassed or you will become redundant.
Right. Well, let's dig into AI for a second there. I mean, I'm interested in how you're using AI both internally and in a customer facing way. I mean, beyond just underwriting for credit, because I think that's a pretty well established use case for AI. But what else are you doing?
Yeah, great question. So there's several different ways that we're deploying it. So, and I'll walk through a couple of them. So some of them are relatively straightforward. So we are getting pretty significant productivity gains from our software engineering team. So we have about 200 software engineers, and we're seeing a 15 to 20% productivity boost with them using AI tools to help them with how they are developing software and developing code. And a lot of it is, helping with some of the simpler but more mundane, repetitive coding tasks that you would see a typical developer use. So that's also, relatively new, but it's also a pretty well-established use case for generative AI. We're using it in our customer support group. And so, a lot of these big customers that we serve, when we're operating, say, the Best Buy program, Best Buy has a very specific ethos of how they deal with their clients. And they want us to emulate that when we interact with them on the phone, over email, via chat. And you think about how hard that is to train stylistically for a customer support agent, that, this is the tone you should write an email in. This is the tone you should use when you're on the phone. This is the tone that a chatbot should use. And so AI is particularly helpful with that, where you can feed it sample data on how Best Buy wants you to interact with their client base. And then we use that in training, and we also use it in prompting on generating AI generated emails. And so it's very, very helpful. And you can imagine that tone is different from one customer to another. And we have to be able to deal with all of that complexity. So it's super useful with respect to that. And then the other area that I think is really interesting, and it's relatively new for us, is we're helping our clients find white space within their customers. So, for example, some of our merchants have 30, 40,000 buyers that they're dealing with, and it's really difficult to ascertain, are you getting the right share of wallet from all of those customers? Are all of those customers spending with you uniformly? Or are there gaps, white space, that you could be chasing within a particular client? And so we're starting now to use AI overlays to basically identify sales and marketing opportunities for our merchants, where we can say to them, you know what, customer A looks like customer B, but customer A is spending quite a lot more than customer B. This is the potential white space in customer B. You could go talk to them about, printers, toner cartridges, whatever we have identified as the SKUs that they're not buying from you. And so we're pretty excited about some of the early work we're doing there and what it could mean for our customers.
Right. Okay. So one thing that I noticed when I was doing a little research on you guys is that you just recently announced a partnership with HSBC, obviously a major global bank. What are you doing with them?
Yeah, and you made the point earlier that trade credit has been around basically since the dawn of time, just about, and HSBC is one of really the original trade credit banks, and obviously historically Hong Kong was such a hub for trade between the West and the East that they've really been in that trade credit space for several hundred years. So what we're doing with HSBC is that they are the biggest provider of trade credit and receivables finance today. They're the biggest bank and the biggest provider of this today. And we have our platform has been developed in such a manner that we can plug banks and other third-party lenders into our platform. And so we are going to be using our platform with HSBC to market to their customers and allow them to offer our platform to the customers that they're selling trade receivables and trade finance solutions to. And this is a way for them to essentially offer more to the customers that they have today without necessarily having to go and build all of this capability in-house. And that's sort of one part of the relationship. The other part of the relationship for us is that there are several markets, particularly in Asia, which are more complicated, very complicated, in fact, to operate in, like India and China are two good examples, where HSBC is very well placed and positioned, and they're going to help us market and operate in those countries because they have established presences there already. And in a place like China, you actually can't do what we do without a banking license. And so you really need to have a bank as a partner. So it's a really cool relationship where we're helping them with technology and helping them modernize the offering that they have to their clients. And they're really helping us enter a bunch of new markets that our customers really care about today.
Right. So I'm curious about the fact that we're recording this. I should sort of mention this. April 30th, we're recording this because things change pretty rapidly politically these days. I'm talking about tariffs and the impact that's having on trade. We just got the GDP numbers out this morning, and I saw that imports are up, and that means GDP is down. What are your customers doing? How are they handling this? What impact is this having on your business?
One of the major industries we serve is manufacturing, and within that, there's automotive and semiconductor and high tech. There's a number of different sub industries, and obviously those industries are a lot of their input costs are from component suppliers, many of whom are Chinese. And so there is a lot of complexity that those clients are dealing with right now. And whether it's trying to figure out alternative sources of supply, whether it's trying to figure out how much of the tariff can they consume versus how much they have to pass on. And so, we're actively engaged in working with all of them, seeing if there's any way we can help, if there's anything we can do to be of assistance. But it's a pretty complicated time because as you know, like a global supply chain takes years to establish, and you can't just pivot it. You can't just all of
Right.
a sudden say, I used to buy from there and now I'm going to buy from here. It's massively complex. And so and we also don't know, is this going to be the new normal or is this just a tactic? And so I think it's very uncertain, and a lot of the clients we work with are dealing with that. In the short term, for us, ironically, it's probably going to be beneficial because prices are going to rise. And
Right.
if prices rise, then the way our business model works, we'll end up making more money. But I think the longer term impact of this is obviously what we're all worried about is, does it trigger some form of US or more general recession? And I think
Right.
that would be bad for everyone.
Right, for sure. So when I first came across your name, I assumed you were a startup. I've been around fintech for a while, and I had never heard of TreviPay until fairly recently. And
Hmm.
then when I dug into it, I realized you used to be called MSTS, and I've heard of that
Yes.
name for a long time. So what was behind the rebrand from
Uh-huh.
MSTS to TreviPay, and why did you settle on that name?
So firstly, MSTS stood for what was a really simple multi-service technology solutions. So
Okay.
so it was an awful mouthful, and it wasn't really descriptive of what the company did. And so we felt that a rebrand was necessary. And right at the time that we did the rebrand, we got acquired by private equity, and so part of that process was, okay, let's rebrand the business, and pick something that was easier to remember, that was more descriptive of what we actually did. Then the question was, well, what do you call yourself? And so a lot of what we spent time thinking about was, we wanted to have a name that was A, reflective of what we did, and B, paid some sort of homage to where the company had evolved from. And so what most people probably don't know is that Kansas City is really well known for its fountains. So it
Hmm.
has like the largest number of fountains for any metro area, per square kilometer of any other city. And so we've thought, okay, something that has a reflection back on the fountains would be interesting. But we also wanted something that felt a little more international, because a lot of what we do is international and cross border, and the conversations we've been having. And then the final reason why we picked Trevi as the name, obviously the famous fountain in Rome, is it's at the confluence of three roads. And we help the buyer. There's a three party in our relationship. There's the buyer, there's the seller, there's us. And so we loved how that all just fitted together, the three roads coming together. For
Hmm.
us, it was, those fountains brought water into the city. It's how the population in the cities were able to have access to fresh water. And for us, in our world, the water is the flow of money. It's the flow of cash. And so
Right.
we've sort of felt all those little images like work beautifully, and paid homage to the fact that the company started in Kansas City.
Interesting. Well, what an interesting story there. Okay, so last question then. What's your vision for TreviPay now?
So I think that this entire B2B landscape is going to go through a transformation, much like we saw in the consumer space. And I think what is at the heart of this is simplifying this inherent complexity that exists in B2B. One of the core things that we really believe in, and we have this as a sort of catchphrase, is that loyalty begins at the payment. And what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is, so much of how our consumer lives have changed is, there's been a shift from brand loyalty to being loyal to a particular experience. So there's a shift from brand to experience loyalty. And again, what I mean by that is, if you think about why people use online shopping so much these days, it's just simpler. You have so many easier choices, or why people use Ubers versus taxi cabs, because you don't have to worry about how the payment is happening, or telling the driver where you're going. All that stuff is just embedded in the way you interact. And so the experience is simpler and much, much easier, much more consumable. And so we think that that is where B2B needs to go. That's what we're focused on. So our vision for the company is, how do we simplify and solve some of these inherent B2B complexities in each of these countries, in each of these industries, so that ultimately for our customers, we want their buyers to have a better experience of working with them as a seller. And we really believe that if that's true, your buyers will spend more money with you. Your share of wallet will go up because they have a better experience working with you than working with your competitor.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Well, Brandon, it was really fascinating chatting with you. Great to learn more about TreviPay, and thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for your time. It was a really good conversation. Thank you, Peter.
After we stopped recording, we were discussing how the B2B payment space, being 5 to 10 years behind consumer payments as we discussed, there's a lot of work still left to be done, but this means big opportunities for companies like TreviPay. We have a long way to go before an international B2B payment is as simple as taking an Uber, but we are moving in that direction. The customer experience is only going to continue to get better, and that is good news for consumers and B2B companies alike. Anyway, that's it for today's show. If you enjoy these episodes, please go ahead and subscribe, tell a friend, or leave a review. And thanks so much for listening.